Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thanks for joining us. My name is Max Odkins. I'm an environmental scientist with the Fire and Resource Assessment Program here at CAL FIRE, and I'm very excited to have you here today for this presentation. This is an invited presentation, unlike our usual webinars, which usually focus on research conducted by our grantees in the Forest Health Research Program. This is a special invitation for Dr. Judson Boomhauer from University of California, San Diego for this presentation, The Distribution and Consequences of Disaster Property Losses, Evidence from Tax Returns of Wildfire Victims. Before we get started, we do have some brief housekeeping. First off, this presentation is part of CAL FIRE's Forest Health Research Program, which is funded in part by California Climate Investments, which puts cap and trade dollars to work in communities throughout California. Our research program aims to prioritize and fund research in forest health and fire science critical to the state of California, share scientific information, and support statewide plans, including the California Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan. To date, we've funded 114 competitive grants for about $34 million, and you can find out more information about our grant program at the link that's posted on this slide or through the QR code that's on this slide as well. During this presentation, we are recording, and the recording will be posted to our webinars and events webpage. Again, there's a link and a QR code for anyone who's interested in seeing our past recordings, and you can check back to that webpage in the near future for a recording of this webinar as well. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so go ahead and use the chat feature or raise your hand at any point during the presentation, and we will get to your questions at the end. So with that, I will pass things over to my colleague at the Fire and Resource Assessment Program, Sam Evans, to introduce today's speaker. Go ahead, Sam.
Thanks, Max. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sam Evans. I'm a research economist with FRAP, and it's my pleasure today to introduce today's speaker, Judd Boomhauer. Dr. Boomhauer is an assistant professor of economics at the University of California, San Diego, and a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. His work focuses on the economics of environmental risk, particularly at the intersection of climate change, insurance markets, and public policy. His work has provided important insights into how wildfire risks are distributed and managed, and how policies can be designed to mitigate these risks effectively. Dr. Boomhauer's research has been featured in leading academic journals and has informed discussions on wildfire policy and insurance regulation. Thanks, Judd, for joining us today, and I look forward to your presentation. So the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Max and Sam, for having me, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm really excited to do this. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I think you're going to see everything for a minute, and I think you see some slides now. So yeah, I'm quite happy to be here. As Sam said, I'm an economist, and a lot of my work in the last 5 or so years is focused on managing wildfire risk. And so I'm excited to put this in front of you all. It is kind of unapologetically a very social science talk, and I'm interested in getting this group's reaction to what we're going to show. The broad idea of this paper is it's going to build on some work that I've done previously with Patrick Bayless, who I work with really frequently, where we've previously done a lot of work to understand what predicts survival and vulnerability of structures during wildfires. We're now going to use a bunch of data that we assembled during that work to try and understand the economic consequences to people who lose their home in a catastrophic disaster event like a wildfire. So this paper is co-authored with Patrick, who's at the University of British Columbia, as well as Jonathan Culver at Virginia and John Voorhees at the U.S. Census Bureau. Okay, I'll just quickly say, the broad motivation here is that in a world where wildfires and other disasters are becoming more frequent and more severe, in order to design policy to adapt to this risk, it's really important that we understand who it is that's suffering these losses and what those losses imply for people's lives. This is how I motivate the paper for my academic colleagues. I'll go relatively quickly through this for a world of people that are already on board with me that wildfire is an important risk. But we argue that we don't, thinking broadly about disasters, not just fire, we don't have as good of an understanding as we would like to have about the economic consequences and the distribution of this risk across people. Not because we haven't had a ton of good work. We have certainly had a ton of good work on these risks, but there are some things where we still have open issues and open questions. And one of the things that is true in the social science literature about the effects of disasters is it's very unusual to have property level or individual level loss data. Usually we will need to proxy for the losses that some individual experienced with a measure of area average exposure, like the amount of flood experienced by a zip code, or whether or not a given property was inside the perimeter of a wildfire. We know, of course, that the true losses that any household experiences can vary actually a lot over very short distances, both because these hazards can vary microspatially, but also because different households make different choices about adaptation investments. And we know that those investments can be really important in determining structure vulnerability. So I have work with Patrick about the importance of California building codes in determining structure survival during wildfires. That is one of many factors that leads to sort of a patchwork of destroyed and surviving homes on the same street that everyone on this call will be familiar with. Catherine Wagner and others have nice work about floods that show there's a similar pattern of highly idiosyncratic losses over short distances. And in floods, it's because some people have elevated their homes and some people haven't elevated their homes. So we think that working with those sort of aggregate damage data is going to obscure some of the details of the relationship between loss and financial consequences. We also, most of the work that we have here tends to focus on credit outcomes because that's usually what's readily available from credit bureaus. So we have a pretty good sense of the likelihood that someone who suffers a disaster is going to eventually declare bankruptcy or experience a foreclosure event. Those are really, really important events, and we absolutely want to understand them. But it's difficult, as I would say as an economist, it's difficult to map that directly to a utility function. For a civilian outside of economics, I would say it's hard to understand exactly what we should make of the fact that someone declared bankruptcy. We'd rather be able to understand things like what is happening to their income and what is happening to their total assets. Most of the literature is focused on hurricanes and floods. Of course, as we all know, if you talk to insurers, they'll tell you what they're really worried about these days, where they're really seeing rapidly increasing losses, is from what they call the secondary perils, where wildfire is an absolutely leading candidate, as well as things like severe windstorms and hailstorms. And then lastly, most of the really nice literature on the economic effects of natural disasters is focused on case studies of one or two really exceptional events. And Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Harvey are the most studied events here. We know a lot about those super outlier big events. We don't know a lot about the effects of, what you might think of as more typical catastrophic disaster events. Okay, so all of that is to say, I think what we're going to do in this paper is gonna add to the literature. So what we do in this paper is we're going to study over 100 damaging U.S. wildfires. And in each of those fires, what we're going to do is we're going to merge address level, structure level damage data to individual restricted access microdata from the U.S. Census and the IRS on the people who were living in that structure at the time of the fire. What that's going to let us do is it's going to let us, one, deliver a pretty nuanced understanding of exactly who are the individuals that are suffering wildfire property loss. So we'll talk both about the distribution of wildfire hazard, which is what are the demographic characteristics of people who are experiencing being inside of a wildfire perimeter. And we'll also talk about the distribution of wildfire structure vulnerability, where vulnerability is people who are losing their home when they suffer a wildfire as opposed to having their home survive with minimal damage. Once we've done that descriptive work to describe, the population that's affected by these events, then we're going to use the income data from the IRS and some other IRS data to understand the effect of the wildfire event on income, employment, and migration in the years following the wildfire for people, the individuals who are living in the structures that were affected by the fire. And I should say, by the way, that the norm that I'm used to in these sorts of talks is that you will interrupt me at any point if you have questions. And I'm planning to leave 10 minutes at the end for Q&A, but don't hesitate to interrupt earlier if you want to know things. So I'll tell you kind of some of the answers before I go through the details of the paper. What we find is, on average, the victims of wildfire have higher pre-fire incomes on average, are more likely to be white, and are older than the US population. That's in some ways not surprising, the income point in particular, because a lot of the population that we're looking at is in California. And in California, nominal wages are high relative to the rest of the country. So we have to be a little careful when we interpret that income result. Importantly, though, there's a really wide distribution of pre-fire income for people who are suffering the loss. And about 25% of the people who are losing their home in a wildfire have pre-fire income below $42,000. We see this consistent pattern that within our research team, we started to refer to as a structure vulnerability gap, which is that the average pre-fire income for the occupants of homes that end up getting destroyed by the fire is systematically lower than homes inside the wildfire perimeter that survive, which is to say, homes occupied by relatively wealthier people on average have a higher probability of surviving wildfires. That's an interesting result that we'll try and unpack a little bit. And then when we move on to understanding the consequences of the fire on economic stability of homes in the wake of the fire, we're going to find that your average wildfire victim experiences 4 years of earning losses, and that those losses peak at about 10% in the second and third year before coming back to zero. We're going to find, I think, unsurprisingly, although it's important to be able to show this, that those earnings losses are concentrated among the people who were living in homes that were destroyed by the fire relative to people whose homes survived. We're also going to show, interestingly, that those losses end up being larger for people that choose to migrate away. And that is to people that follow the disaster literature outside of wildfires, that's a surprising result. In the hurricane literature, people that choose to migrate away after the event tend to do better because they earn higher wages in other places that were not affected by the storm. And we're going to have the opposite pattern here, and we'll unpack kind of the economics of what we think is going on with that. And finally, on the migration front, our data on migration are not perfect. What we're going to be able to observe is the address from which people are filing their taxes in the years following the fire. But we're going to conclude that at least 10% of the occupants of destroyed homes are living in a different county in the years following the fire. And of that 10%, most of them are still gone after 4 years. Okay, as I said, there's a really nice literature about the economic effects of wildfires and other disasters. I'm not going to do it justice just because this is a relatively short seminar, but when the paper is available, it will cite all this work and more. So let me tell you a little bit about the data that we're using in the study. This is, of course, not a surprise to anyone on this call. The typical pattern of property losses in an urban wildfire disaster is bimodal, in the sense that we know properties tend to be either a complete loss or to come through with relatively minimal damage. There is, of course, also a group of properties in the middle that suffer moderate amounts of loss, but that group tends to be pretty small. So what have we done? Patrick and I, in our earlier work, have put together a data set with a lot of help from folks at CAL FIRE. So I should thank a lot of people who may be on this call. I can't see who's on the call, but we've had a lot of really generous assistance from CAL FIRE to build this data set that we think includes something like 70% of the homes in the US that were exposed to a wildfire between 2003 and 2020, and 90+% that were exposed to wildfires between 2010 and 2020. There are, 150-ish wildfires in the data set. And where are the data coming from? A lot of it is the modern DINS data set that I'm sure everyone on this call is familiar with, that since about 2013 has very nice, readily accessible damage census, post-fire damage census data for California fires. We also worked with some really generous folks at CAL FIRE to bring in some older archival damage inspection data that at least when we were doing this were not readily available in the quote unquote modern DINS data set. And then the hard data collection effort here was to try and bring in some damage data for states outside of California that haven't done the same work of centralizing damage assessments that California has done. So we worked with individual county assessors for several counties in Oregon, Washington, Arizona, and Colorado to put together the best data we could on outcomes for fires outside of California. I will also show you a little bit of data today for the 2025 LA fires. The LA fires are not going to be in our core research data set. And of course, we're not going to be able to say yet what the economic consequences of the LA fires in the years following the fire will be, because of course it's still 2025. But we are going to be able to talk about the demographics of people who lost their homes in the LA fires. Okay, that's the damage data set. The earnings data and the demographic data are coming from the IRS and the Census Bureau. And this is where our co-authors, John Voorhees and John Colmer, have been instrumental. What we've done is we've used the address information in the damage data to locate the census and IRS data on the individuals who were living in those structures in the year that the fire happened. The core administrative data set here is called the Environmental Impacts Frame. This is a product that the Census Bureau has built that brings together a lot of this individual level tax filing data and decennial census data to give us rich information about where people are living, how much money they're earning, and lots of other really useful demographic data. Then what we're going to do for every wildfire in the data, we're going to define, this says 3, we now have 4. I'll tell you about the 4th in a minute. We're going to define 3 groups in the environmental impact frame based on how they experienced the wildfire. We're going to have one group of people that were living in the structures that we can see in our damage data were destroyed. We're going to have another group of people that were living in the structures that we can see in our data were inside the wildfire perimeter, but were not destroyed. We're going to call that the survived home group. And then we're going to have a third group that's a comparison sample of individuals outside the wildfire perimeter, but close by. So in most of what I'll show you today, that'll be individuals outside the burned area up to 25 kilometers away. We've now also constructed a 4th comparison sample that I can't show you results for yet because we haven't gone through the census disclosure process to be able to make the results public. But the 4th comparison group is going to be individuals randomly drawn from the same state that the wildfire happened in, but far away in what we would call a different commuting zone from the wildfire. And that's going to be a group of individuals that we're going to think of as almost entirely unaffected by this fire event. Okay, so what are we going to do for all those groups? We will track everyone who is living in these structures. We'll track them in the years after the fire. We'll understand where they were in the years before the fire. And as long as they don't leave the United States, we can see them. They'll stay in our data because this is federal data. And this is going to be, by construction, a mix of owners and renters because it's everyone who was living in the structures that experienced the fire. And we, in follow-up work, we hope to be able to use some of the information about who's claiming the the mortgage tax deduction to understand which of the people in our data might be homeowners. For now, everything I'm going to show you is a mix of results for owners and renters. Okay, so the merged data set, the numbers on the bottom here are no longer correct. I'll tell you what's wrong with them in a minute. But the merged data set, you should know, is restricted to single family homes, and that's because that's the structure type where we can get a really high confidence merge to the census master address data for technical reasons I'm happy to explain to anyone after the call. It turns out to be not a really important, or not a hugely binding restriction to restrict to single family homes, in the sense that that's the dominant property type in most of the burned areas that we're going to be thinking about anyway. And when we do the income analyses, we're going to restrict our primary analysis to prime age workers, so people between 25 and 65. On the bottom of the slide, we're showing you the number of homes and occupants in each of the groups. The survived numbers here are out of date. We've done a better job now updating the merge on the survived, so that, again, we haven't disclosed the new merge rate, but think of this as approximately 50,000 homes in total across the destroyed and survived group, and approximately 60% of them are going to be in the survived group. Just to give you an example of one of the fires in the data, this is the Glass Fire in Napa and Sonoma counties in 2020. The orange line here is the burned area perimeter. The green triangles are showing you individual structures that were inside the burn perimeter but not destroyed. And the orange diamonds are showing you structures that were destroyed by the fire. And then we have these two buffer regions outside the fire. This one is 10 kilometers and this one is 25 kilometers. And you can see in the buffer region, we're showing these gray circles represent a random sample of homes outside the burned area that's going to be in what we would call our adjacent sample, our adjacent comparison sample. Importantly, just to kind of fix ideas in your mind about what the composition of these adjacent samples might look like compared to the composition of people experiencing the fire, the Glass Fire is a helpful example. This is the city of Santa Rosa, right? So, there are lots of reasons that this densely populated area is a little different than the area where the Glass Fire was centered. Okay, so that's one example of the many fires in the data set. So now let's talk a little bit about how we're going to use that data to understand who it is that's experiencing wildfires, and then in particular who it is that's losing their home in wildfire events. This table is comparing some descriptive information about the people who experienced the fires in our data set to other interesting comparison benchmarks. So on the left-hand side here, I'm pooling together all of the individuals who are living in homes that were destroyed by the fire, as well as homes inside the wildfire perimeter that survived. And on average, their pre-fire adjusted gross income on their tax filings, which is going to be our main income concept, is going to be about $145,000 a year. If we just think about W-2 wage earnings, that's about $87,000 a year in this group. 80-ish% of these people are white, about 8% are Hispanic, and the average age of the tax filers in this group is 53. How does that compare to other groups you might want to compare against? Well, remember, our sample is restricted to people who live in single-family homes. So one natural comparison sample is everyone in the United States who lives in a single-family home. So we've drawn that comparison sample in the second column, and you can see that our individuals have a markedly higher income, higher pre-fire income than your average American who lives in a single family home. Again, this is all of the United States, including places where nominal wages are not as high as they are in California. So interpret that carefully. And our sample is also a little bit whiter than the overall sample of Americans who live in single-family homes, and it's older. Those general patterns hold when you compare to the U.S. population overall, people who live in all different kinds of housing. They also hold to a smaller extent when you compare to people living just outside the burned area. So remember when I showed you the picture of the glass fire and pointed to Santa Rosa just outside the perimeter, people just outside the burned areas of the fire up to 25 kilometers away tend to have a little bit lower income and tend to be more racially diverse than the affected areas. I think I saw a hand pop up if I'm interpreting my teams correctly. Is that right?
Yep, that's right. Justin, go ahead.
Yeah, so I see this as wildfire hazard. Wouldn't this be vulnerability?
So we're going to call that. So I'm going to call this that it's a fair point. This one I'm going to call hazard because this is the people who are in a. Okay, so I think about hazard as your probability of experiencing a wildfire, and I think about vulnerability as the probability that you're going to have damage conditional on experiencing a wildfire. So far I'm pooling together everyone whose house was destroyed and whose house was not destroyed. So that's why I'm going to call this hazard. And then in a minute, I'm going to pull apart the people in the survived and the destroyed group, and I'm going to call the destroyed group. I'm going to say that tells us something about vulnerability.
Okay. And I guess a follow-up to this question. So I'm struggling a little bit in your presentation to know whether or not this is a planned study that you've got in the works, or if these are results from the study that you've done, or is it somewhere in between?
So these are, I mean, the results are preliminary. So we're doing a little more work to finalize and write things up, but you should think about these as the results of the preliminary results of the study.
I just heard you say we're going to find on several things instead of we found that, and I was just point of clarification. But
I think that's maybe just a semantic.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Very good.
Okay. All right. So the takeaway from this slide so far is that individuals who are living in homes inside of wildfire perimeters, this is how they compare to the U.S. population overall. Another intuitive comparison that you might want to do is what does the income look like for people who experience wildfires relative to people who experience other types of severe weather disasters. I'll go quickly through this because I want to save time for other things, but the basic conclusion here is that relative to people who suffer floods and hurricanes, average income for people in wildfire events tends to be higher. Again, caveat that with the fact that this is California relative to the Gulf Coast, for example. So you have to do some spatial wage deflation in your head. This is where I think this is what Justin was building up to. Let's take those individuals who I was previously pooling together in that group that I called affected, people who whose homes were inside of the wildfire perimeter, regardless of whether the home was destroyed or not destroyed. And now let's pull those two groups apart and let's think about how income and other characteristics compare for the people whose homes end up getting destroyed by the fire relative to the people whose homes are not destroyed by the fire. So the left-hand column here is what I showed you previously, where we were pooling all of those together. In the middle column now, I've got the pre-fire characteristics of people whose homes were destroyed, and in the right-hand column, I have the pre-fire characteristics of homes of people living in homes inside the wildfire perimeter that survived. And this is where you can start to see what we've informally been referring to as a structure vulnerability gap. People who lose their homes tend to be people who prior to the fire had lower income. So average pre-fire adjusted gross income for people in destroyed homes is about $130,000. People in the homes that survived the fire are wealthier in terms of pre-fire income by about $45,000 a year. In terms of other, in terms of racial breakdown and age, there's actually not a lot of difference between the two groups. So this is primarily about income. Before we, I want to unpack that in a minute, but before I unpack that a little bit more, let me just remind you that everything I've shown you so far has been about average income, but that there is, of course, a distribution behind those averages. And I just want to remind you of something I said at the beginning, which is that while the average income of people losing their homes has been relatively high compared to the US population, the lower tail of that distribution includes some very low income folks. And so about 25% of the people that we can see in the study who lost their home in the fire have pre-fire income of about $40,000 or less. Okay. So let's unpack that difference in income, in pre-fire income between destroyed and surviving structures. One of the things we can do to unpack that is we can try and understand whether that is primarily caused by differences in structure survivability within a given fire, or whether that is primarily explained by differences in fire destructiveness across fires that happen in poorer and wealthier areas. So the statistical way that you would unpack that is that you would include what in the economics literature we call fire fixed effects. I think in other fields you might say that you're including fire specific intercepts in the model, for example. But what you see when you do that is that in the overall cross-sectional comparison, that difference in income between people living in destroyed structures and living in surviving structures was about $37,000 a year. When you put the fire-specific intercepts in the model, so you control for an average income level of people experiencing each wildfire, there's still a substantial amount of within event variation in income between the people who are living in homes destroyed by the fire and homes not destroyed by the fire. So whatever that is driving this vulnerability gap is not just explained by differences across fires, but is also coming from differences within homes experiencing the same event. I'm going to come back to the LA fires in a second, but let me now say a little bit about, what we think are some potential mechanisms for that structure vulnerability gap. And this is one place that we want to do some more statistical digging before we release the full paper in its entirety. So one possibility, of course, is that there's some spatial sorting. So it may be that lower income people are more likely to live in areas where structures are less likely to survive. And a key, factor that you might have in your mind there is lot size and distance between structures. Denser areas may well be more dangerous. And to the extent that lower income individuals live on smaller lots and closer to other homes, that may be explaining part of the structure vulnerability gap. There are other interesting things you can think of as well. So Patrick and I have work on the importance of vintage and wildfire building codes, and we know that more affluent people on average are more likely to live in more recently built homes. There may be differences in defensible space, and you can imagine other stories as well that I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. But just to manage my time, let me go back for a minute and show you what I promised to show you about the 2025 LA fires. So relative to, let's see, what do I want to tell you about? I want to tell you folks who experienced the Eden fire and lost their home had average pre-fire income of about $140,000 a year. Individuals who lived in homes inside the Eden fire perimeter but didn't lose their home, again, had a higher income. So we see this structure vulnerability gap in the Eden fire as well. But these are all relatively high income groups on average. And then, of course, as we all know, the Palisades is quite an affluent area. So mean AGI among the destroyed and the survived group is really strikingly high. Remember that these are means, so there are some high individuals here pulling these means up. Even in the Palisades, though, we do see this same gap in income between people living in survived and destroyed homes. Okay, so that's what I have to show you on the distribution of pre-fire characteristics for people who are experiencing these losses. What I want to use my last 14-ish minutes to do is I want to tell you what we can learn from the tax data about losing the home on people's lives after the fire. If this was an economics audience, I'd spend more time setting up a conceptual framework for how we should think about the economic effects that I'm going to show you in sort of a very simple theoretical or conceptual model. What I'll do in this talk is I'll try and set this within the broader picture of all of the things that change in your family's financial situation when you lose your home in a fire. One very important thing that happens, of course, is that you suffer a big loss represented by the cost of rebuilding the structure, or the value of the structure that burned down. So here in this very simple expression, I'm thinking about that structure loss as minus L. And some of that, for most families, is compensated by insurance. I'll show you some data at the end of the talk about the fraction of losses on average that are covered by insurance. We know that most people are not fully insured. Most people don't have enough insurance, but also most people have some amount of insurance. So the net property damages after taking out insurance is going to be one really important financial consequence of the fire. What we're able to measure in this study, though, are two other also potentially important consequences. Any short-run income change in the wake of the fire that happens, for example, because you move away and your employment relationship is disrupted and you have to find a new job, or because your employer is disrupted by the fire and has to lay you off temporarily, or because you need to take time off to manage the incredibly demanding process of rebuilding your house from the ground up. That's all going to show up in these short-run income changes that we're going to be able to measure. And then the present discounted value of any longer-run income change that results from having experienced the wildfire. And so here, we're going to be able to follow people for about 4 years after the fire. We're going to understand those medium to longer run effects of the fire on earnings. Okay. Here, I understand that I'm not talking to an economic audience, so I'll give you the intuition of the statistical model here. This is what we would call in our literature an event study. What we're going to do is we're going to run these regressions that are going to compare the evolution of various economic outcomes before and after the fire for people who are living in destroyed homes against people who were living in that adjacent area just outside the fire. So there's a comparison, an omitted comparison group in this regression that is the people living just outside the wildfire burned area. And we are going to we're going to measure the evolution over time of things like income and migration against what's happening in that group. So think about differencing out, netting out in each fire, what's happening in the people just outside the wildfire burned area to understand the differential effect on people who are living in homes that were destroyed by the fire, and separately, the differential effect on people who are living in homes inside the wildfire area that survived. And for the people who have their statistics hats on, we're also running these regressions for using a comparison group that's not the groups in the adjacent area just outside the fire. The regressions that we're running now that we'll soon be able to disclose are going to compare instead to people living far away from the fire who are matched on observables to people inside the fire. Okay. If that was too much, too fast, I'm happy to talk more about what's going on here in the Q&A. So this is the graphical version of the main result for income. So here what I'm doing is I'm pooling together occupants of destroyed and surviving structures and comparing their income over time to income for people living just outside the wildfire burned area. So think about the vertical axis here as telling you the log difference in income between people affected by the fire and people just outside the fire. Reassuringly, in the years prior to the wildfire, that difference is 0. This tells you that our statistical strategy is doing what it's supposed to be doing. In the year of the fire, we see an income dip for people living inside the fire area. Remember that most of these fires are occurring in September, October, November, and so this small dip represents a partial year loss of earnings. In the first full year after the fire, earnings on average for people living inside the wildfire perimeter are about 5% below people just outside. And that average dip persists for 3-ish years and comes back to 0 around year 4. What the really granular loss data let us do is they let us separate out the income effects for people who are living in structures destroyed by the fire relative to structures that were not destroyed by the fire. And by not destroyed, I mean inside the fire perimeter, but structure survived. Okay, and so what you can see then is that those income effects that we were talking about are particularly large. They're driven by individuals that were living in the homes that were destroyed. So those individuals in the first and second full year after the fire have about a 10-ish percentage point decrease in their income relative to people living just outside the wildfire burned area. And that comes back to 0 after about 4 years. Folks who are living in survived structures maybe experience some small income effect, but it's substantially smaller than the people in destroyed homes. We can run that using wages as the outcome variable instead of AGI. That's really for the economics aficionados, so we see basically the same result. We see a little bit of an effect on employment. This is a very extreme definition of unemployment. This is the fraction of people in these groups who are reporting 0 wages during the entire calendar year. There's about a 1% increase in the destroyed group in the probability of having no wages. We also see, and this is the result about mobility, about migration. One caveat that I want to say when I present this figure is you can see on the left-hand side of the figure that these, the orange and the purple ribbon are comparing the mobility, the relative mobility of people outside. Sorry, let me say that better. On the left-hand side of the figure, I'm showing you the relative mobility of people inside the fire perimeter against people living just outside the fire perimeter. So what you should see over here on the left is that even before the fire, people who were living outside the wildfire perimeter are differentially mobile. We think about this as probably driven by the fact that these may be more recently built areas. These may just be, as we saw in the glass fire, like systematically different populations. And so that is a caveat that we need to keep in mind when we interpret this picture. Even, accepting that caveat, there's a clear effect on outmigration for people that were living in destroyed structures in the years following the wildfire. So this is showing you the fraction of people making long distance moves, which we're calling filing your taxes from a different county than the county you were living in when the fire happened. And this is like a 10 to 15%-ish effect, and it's persisting for many years after the fire. This is the result about folks who choose to move away versus folks who choose to stay. it's very important to understand in this particular picture that I'm showing you, we're not only talking about causal effects anymore. So I would argue that you can interpret a lot of what I've shown you mostly through a causal framework, in the sense that that was the effect of the fire on the various outcomes we were studying. Now we're going to break that out and think about people who chose to move away in response to the disaster versus people who chose to stay in response to the disaster. Now we've moved out of the kind of natural experiment land, and we're very much understand that there are likely to be lots of things that are different between people who choose to move away and people who choose to stay. So of course, we're not arguing that this result is showing you the causal effect of experiencing a fire and then moving away. But it is interesting to see descriptively that folks who move after losing their home in the fire do substantially worse economically than folks who stay. And I'm curious to hear other people's reaction to this. I think one natural reaction to this is that in the wildfire setting, it may well be that the more affluent folks are more likely to have insurance, more likely to be able to afford the rebuild, and so they're more likely to stay, and that more economically vulnerable folks are the ones who are going to have to respond to the event by moving away, going to stay with family somewhere else, etc. We are working on lots of sensitivity and robustness checks that I'm not going to take our time to talk to you about. To sort of wrap up, what do we learn from the second part of the paper about the effects of the fire? If you draw on, some existing literature, my favorite paper about what fraction of wildfire losses tend to be insured is by Phil Mulder and some of his co-authors, working with really great insurance data from the Marshall Fire in Colorado. They show that about 80% to 90% of reconstruction costs are covered by insurance on average. That's in Colorado, of course. There are reasons that California might be different. If you just roughly use that number as a ballpark benchmark and a rough $600,000 reconstruction cost for a typical California home, that's going to give you somewhere on the order of $70,000 to $100,000 of just net property losses. If you take the income effects that we're measuring and load those on top of it, it's going to give you another $40,000-ish per year in financial, sorry, not per year, another total $40,000-ish of losses for households who experience this disaster on average. You might think about these property losses as being at least in principle insurable through private insurance markets. This earning risk is impossible to insure through private markets. And instead, this is going to fall either on households themselves or potentially on public assistance programs for low-income people that are suffering these losses. Okay, that's pretty much all I had to tell you. I'll skip that slide, and then I want to make sure we save some time for Q&A because I'm eager to hear what this group thinks.
Great, Judd. Thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation. So let's give everyone a second to gather your thoughts. And if you have any questions, feel free to either put them in the chat or raise your hand. Maybe while we're waiting, Judd,